Hello, and welcome to this, the first of my new podcast series, Adventurous Places, where I'll discuss the history of an interesting city or landmark I have visited on one of my adventures. Firstly, a few disclaimers. Though I have lived in Scotland my entire life, I cannot speak anything more than the most basic Gaelic, so apologies if I mess up some pronunciations or translations. Secondly, I'm not going to elaborate on the politics of Scotland and further reaching background behind many of the historical events discussed, as these can get very complicated, largely because the only thing the Scots like doing more than fighting the English is fighting other Scots. Lastly, though I have tried to be as accurate as I can, accounts and dates can differ. Where possible, I've tried to use the most reliable source or the most quoted date, however I will link to all sources used. Anyway, where better to start our adventures than my hometown of the last 7 years, the glorious Dundee. With many epithets and many more dubious statistics, it certainly has one hell of a reputation. We can claim titles ranging from the sunniest city in Scotland to the more dubious award of being its abortion capital, in addition to the drugs death capital of Europe, a title we fought hard to win from Glasgow in 2018. On a lighter note, we can also claim Dennis the Menace, orange marmalade, and the adhesive postage stamp among our inventions. Located about an hour and a half north of the Scottish capital, it is built on the banks of the River Tay, with a population a shade under 150,000, which makes it the fourth largest city in Scotland. While the city has many nicknames, including Scumdee, accurate, Fundee, very accurate, and Sundee, yeah, pretty accurate, the name Dundee itself is of very interesting origins. The Dun part is a common Gaelic and Pictish word for fort, as is seen in many other Scottish names, such as Dunkeld and Dunfermline. But the D is a different story. There are three potential origins to this ending which I can find, but as with many ancient names, the true origin is probably lost to time. The first potential being from the Gaelic Daig, or its shortened form Dare, meaning good, giving us the good fort. The second being a corruption of Dun Tay, or fort on the Tay, and the third being named after a local chieftain Daig, meaning fort of Daig. A wildly different folk origin, apparently first recorded by the Scottish historian Hector Boyce in his 16th century Historica Genitis Scotorum, or History of the Scottish People, is that it was named Dedoinum, or God's Gift, by David, the younger brother of the Scottish king William I, in the 1100s, after returning from the Holy Land, which is an adventure worthy of its own telling. Regardless of the truth behind this story, one of Dundee's mottos is Dedoinum, with its second being the oft-heard mating call of the Dundee youth, "Gie us your chips and show us your tits," though in reality it's much more mundane, with thought and purity, which I'm not even going to attempt in Latin. Regardless of where the name came from, the area that would later become known as Dundee is old, with human habitation being traced back to the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age. Progression through the Neolithic and Bronze Age saw an increase in the number of structures present, with a hill fort atop the Law, more on that later, appearing in the Iron Age. It seems that Dundee and the surrounding area briefly became incorporated into the Roman Empire during Agricola's unsuccessful conquest of Caledonia, where it was called Electum and became a port supplying the advance. There seems to be little discernible history over the next millennia, save for the probable last stand of the vilified Macbeth at the nearby fort of Dunsinane in 1054. In 1190, the aforementioned David, Earl of Huntingdon, was granted superiority over the town by his brother King William I of Scotland, when he may have renamed it. What is more certain, however, is that he ordered the construction of Dundee Castle. A year later, in 1191, King William awarded Dundee a royal charter, allowing them to hold court. In 1219, Earl David died shortly before Dundee, and the rest of Scotland was plunged into chaos. By the year 1292, Dundee had been inherited by the new king John Balliol, and was proclaimed a royal borough upon his coronation. A year earlier, as part of an agreement to oversee the picking of a new Scottish king, King Edward I of England, given the charming name of Hammer of the Scots, had received overlordship of Scotland, and installed English governors into Scottish cities. Legend has it, though confirmation is sketchy at best, that later that year, William Wallace, of Braveheart fame, slaughtered the son of the newly appointed governor and fled, hiding as a spinner woman in the nearby village of Longforgan. What is more clear-cut is the fact that, half a decade later, when Balliol rebelled against his overlord, King Edward marched north and occupied Dundee in 1296 until its liberation at the hands of Wallace the next year. Dundee was once again held by the English forces from 1303 until 1312, when that other legendary figure of the Scottish Wars of Independence, Robert de Bruce, the new King of Scotland, once again recaptured it and tore down the castle to prevent its further use against him. St Paul's Cathedral has now replaced the castle, which is only memorialised in its namesake of Castle Street. 72 years later, Edward's great-grandson, Richard II, once again marched north to sack Dundee, among other cities, when Scotland sided against him in the 100 Years' War. By this time, Dundee was a major trading port, importing wine from Western Europe and wood from Scandinavia in exchange for wool and leather, but unfortunately the good times were not destined to last. Keen to maintain the tradition of English kings and get his share of Scottish destruction, the 1542's Husband of the Year award winner, Henry VIII, sent his navy to bombard Dundee in 1547, leading to its near-total destruction. Perhaps having taken on board the hints from the previous 2.5 centuries, Dundee finally had a wall built round it in 1592 to protect it from attack, though these impressive structures did not help it in the next disaster to befall the city, that being a plague during the first decade of the 1600s. The first real test of these walls came in 1651 when the English Civil War spilled over into Scotland. I told you things were complicated. And they failed spectacularly, with the English forces pillaging the city for 2 weeks and slaughtering 1/6 of the population. Later that decade, a storm ravaged the harbour, and towards the end of the century, with competition from Irish and American wool, the industry important to so many of the city's people collapsed, leading to a depopulation. The final chapter of the 1600s comes with a Jacobite hero, John Graham, Viscount of Dundee, who declared his support for the Stuart kings in 1689 and was named Bonnie Dundee as a result. Luckily for the city, this did not end in another sacking. Throughout the 18th century, the city started to bounce back, with its port providing the home for a whaling fleet and all the industry that came along with that, in addition to a resurgence in the textile industry in the shape of linen production. 1797 was a big year for Dundee, with potentially the invention of, and definitely the mass production of, orange marmalade by James and Janet Keeler, adding another industry to Dundee's cobbled streets. While later that year, the Dundee-born and bred Admiral Adam Duncan crushed the Dutch Navy at the Battle of Camperdown, a name which would later be adopted to his estate on the north side of the city. But the zenith was yet to come. By 1801, Dundee had reached a massive population of around 26,000, but 60 years later this had skyrocketed to over 90,000, partly swelled by a large number of Irish immigrants seeking to escape the potato famine, and partly by the massive increase in industry it experienced this century. Due to its prime location on an eastern estuary, combined with its extensive whaling connections, Dundee became the hub for jute processing in the UK. Despite the setbacks of 4 cholera and 2 typhus outbreaks, the 19th century proved the pinnacle of Dundee's success, with large parts of the population employed in whaling, shipbuilding or jute manufacture. As with all industrial cities of the time, though, there was a far darker side. While the factory owners got fat and rich, the workers themselves lived hard and short lives. Indeed, the average life expectancy in Dundee dropped to just 32 years during this period, lower even than the scarily young national average of 48 at the time. If the 19th century saw the zenith of Dundee's prosperity, the 20th saw it come crashing down, perhaps heralded by the Taybridge disaster of 1879, which claimed the lives of 75 individuals one December night. The following century saw a collapse in industry, with cheaper alternatives replacing whale products, jute production moving to India, and the advent of ironclad ships. Though there were a few glimmers of light, such as the continued mass marmalade production, and the comic book heroes of the newly founded DC Thompson Publishing Company providing hope, but Dundee remained a shadow of its former self. It was during this nadir in the middle and the latter half of the 20th century that Dundee seemed to gain its dismal reputation and became the butt of the nation's jokes, both of which have dogged it ever since. The introduction of new industries, such as Timex watches and the ATM manufacturer NCR, helped to keep the city afloat until it could find its new niche. This came in the early 1990s with Rockstar North, or DMA Designs as it was then known, and the major success of their game Grand Theft Auto. Though this development has led to a few jokes of its own, including that legendarily infamous Scottish comedian Frankie Boyle to quip, "Drugs, murder and prostitution. I don't know where that Dundee-based games company gets their ideas from." Though this description is far from inaccurate, the city has made an exceptional effort to move on from its stereotypes, with massive expansions into the gaming, electronics and scientific research fields. An additional £1 billion initiative into the redevelopment and rejuvenation of the city centre and waterfront has led to the idea that Dundee will be a nice city when it's finished. Indeed, it will be nice when it's finished, but it's still one hell of a city at the moment. What a journey that's been through around 6,000 years of Dundonian history. Not many cities could bounce back from some of the lows this one has experienced. But as young travellers, I hear you cry, I don't care about some old histories. Where shall we go in Dundee and what shall we do? And that is a valid question. Where to start? Why not at the centre? Quite literally. Sitting bang slap in the middle of Dundee and visible from just about every point in the city is the Law. Indeed, I'm looking at it from my window as we record. Standing 174 metres above sea level, the Law is a 400-million-year-old volcanic sill that leaked upwards when armoured fish still ruled the seas and our ancestors were just starting to colonise the land. With Scotland being home to some very, very cool dinosaurs, I'm sure it's probably seen some amazing things over the years. But the earliest activity we have evidence for is Bronze Age burials 3,000 years ago. Come the Iron Age, it was home to a hill fort which burnt down, and it then later received its name, the Law, from the Anglo-Saxon word halor, meaning hill or mound. In 1689, it was where our Jacobite friend, Bonnie Dundee, raised his standard and declared for the Stuart Kings, while nearly 200 years later, a railway tunnel was dug beneath it, which I'm determined to find and explore one day. What an adventure that'll be. Anyway, despite being located in the middle of the city, the Law is very green. As we progress up through the old houses at its base, we pass many a large garden on its slopes, until we cross Law Crescent and enter its crown of trees. It's still a steep walk up, but if we follow the spiralling path to the top, we're greeted with immense views round all of Dundee, and far beyond. Behind us, as we look south over the gleaming Tay towards the Kingdom of Fife, stands the War Memorial. Erected in 1925, to those so brutally slain in what was meant to be the war to end all wars, it now honours those who did not return from the even more devastating conflict of the Second World War a quarter of a century later as well. If we cast our eyes about, you will notice Dundee is a very green city in general, with lots of parks, which brings it a beautiful, quiet feel compared to the bustle of many other cities. Returning our gaze to the south, several structures catch our sight. To the distant right, curving away from us, is a replacement Tay Bridge, opened in 1887 to replace its short-lived and ill-fated predecessor. Not far away, you'll see the blue and white buildings of Dundee University's School of Life Sciences, and the many other beautiful and ugly buildings of its campus. Some, like the Tower Building, while providing somewhat of an eyesore, are an iconic part of the skyline, while others, like the Carnelli Building, are simply picturesque. Maybe we shall return to the campus later, for it is an important part of the city. Casting our gaze further east, we spy the Victoria and Albert Museum, opened in 2018. Currently hosting a display on the history of video games, I shall not dwell on this ship-shaped building, for I have strong and somewhat unflattering views on it, which I do not wish to bog you down with. To the right of the Victoria and Albert rests the iconic Royal Research Ship Discovery, which bore Robert Falcon Scott on the first of his missions to the Antarctic, though she's had many other adventures over the years and will get a podcast of her own very soon. If you look closely along the waterline further east, you'll notice a low-lying ship. This is the HMS frigate Unicorn. Built shortly after the Napoleonic Wars, she never saw active service, and indeed only one sea voyage, that from Cheltenham to Dundee, but she is an iconic ship nonetheless. For nearly a century, she acted as a training ship for sailors stationed in Dundee, and is now the sixth oldest ship in the world. There is one last landmark I would like to introduce you to in our fabulous city, though we must descend down to truly appreciate it. We stand at the gates of the Howth burial ground in the city centre. Once part of the Greyfriars Monastery, after the reformation of the church, it was gifted to the people of Dundee where it now provides the eternal home to those such as James and Janet Keeler of marmalade fame, and James Chalmers, who invented the adhesive postage stamp. To step inside removes you from the hustle and bustle of city life into the still quiet of the sanctuary. Many an afternoon has been idly passed sitting here watching the comings and goings of bumblebees and flutterbys. As we sit on a bench, enjoying the sun, it is impossible not to notice the red brick building next to us, which is the headquarters of the D.C. Thompson Publishing Company, responsible for publishing not only several local newspapers, but also the Beano and the late Dandy comic books, home to Dennis the Menace and Desperate Dan respectively. Indeed, several statues commemorating their characters can be found around the corner in front of the Caird Hall. Opposite the D.C. Thompson HQ is the truly spectacular building of the McManus Gallery, combining art gallery and museum of local and national history, with possibly its biggest exhibition being the skeleton of a humpback whale that swam up the Tay in 1883. As I promised, we shall now return briefly to the University of Dundee, for it has been the centre of my life here and is an important aspect of the city in general, for, when combined with Abertay, Dundee's other university, students make up nearly 15% of the city's population. Initially founded as a college of the neighbouring St Andrews University in 1881, it gained its freedom in 1967. Though if we backpedal for a second to the moment of its founding, there is some interesting history to be had. For it would be brought into existence by the generous donation of £140,000 from two giants of Dundonian society, Mary Ann Baxter and John Boyd Baxter, who stipulated it should provide equal education for both sexes. Its first staff roll call would include many legendary figures such as the chemist Thomas Carnelli and the biologist Darcy Thompson, who has the most randomly placed apostrophe in his name, but a spectacular career where he could count the likes of Charles Darwin as his equal. He is a highly interesting character, and I would definitely recommend going to look him up. Since then, it has played host to many other world-changing figures, including the forensic anthropologist Professor Sue Black. I've just finished reading her latest book, and it is fantastic, worth a read. The Nobel Prize winner, Sir James Black, who created the life-changing medication beta blockers, and B.C. Forbes of Forbes magazine fame. Maybe I should move on and stop gushing about the grandness of the university. However, before we do, I challenge you, should you ever visit our city, to come and find the secluded Geddes Quadrangle, the most picturesque place on campus. But no matter how rich its history or how stunning its buildings, no city is complete without its inhabitants. Though I'm not a native to Dundee, having come from further north, I have lived here for long enough to get to know them a little. At the top of the social order, you will find the seagulls. These are our benevolent overlords, to whom we humbly offer our chips in exchange for the sparing of our wretched lives. But, being serious, Dundee seagulls are some big brutes who dominate all before them, and I am honestly surprised a small child hasn't been taken by them yet. It's best to give them a wide berth, and definitely don't eat food outside. As far as us lowly humans go, Dundee is one multicultural city, with students and residents from over 50 countries being represented, though the vast majority of the city is still populated by the native Dundonian. A few moments spent speaking to one of these locals could leave you highly baffled, as Dundee has a very distinct dialect to try and decode. Built around the sound eh, which can be used on its own in many different contexts, or to replace just about any other vowel, such as seen in the word pear, or pie to the uninitiated. Another quirk of the language is the use of circle instead of roundabout, though, to be honest, it does seem a far better way of putting it, save for when applied to the elliptical junction between Glams and Blackness Road, which becomes the circle that's not a circle. Alas, despite the great progress in revitalising the city in recent years, problems still plague it, with unemployment levels being well above the national average, leaving the area rife with drug abuse. That is not to say the city is unsafe, though, far from it. Though Glasgow may hold the title of the friendliest city in Scotland, Dundee cannot be far behind, for no village, town or city has ever made me feel so welcome as has the great city of Dundee. That just about wraps it up for this brief dip into the marvellous city that has been my home for most of the past decade. All that remains is for me to thank you all for listening and to extend special thanks to my old friend Nicole Webber, who helped me out with the Gaelic translations. I'm looking forward to catching you all next time when we will be talking about the RRS Discovery. Until then, stay safe and stay adventurous. Goodbye.